Dan Campion, you are very welcome to the Lead Well podcast.
Mark, thank you so much for having me. Genuinely, really appreciate being here.
So it's familiar surroundings for you, but today you're on the other side of the table. How does that feel?
A bit uncomfortable, I have to say, a little bit uncomfortable. I'm so used to being either on that seat or behind you in the booth.
Well, my job is maybe to make you feel nice and comfortable as you explore 100%. Some of that. So when I was 18, Dan, I worked in Super Queen, right? And at the time I was studying to be a personal trainer. And I remember one day vividly, a lecture ran over and I was looking at my watch. I was saying, I'm going to be late for my shift, right? So I ran from the bus all the way to that clock-in machine. And for anyone who's worked in environments like that, you'll know that they've got those old school clock-in machines where if you're late, you don't get away with it, right? Your pay is also docked as well. So I made it in just on time and out of breath, I ran up the stairs into the changing room. And in my hand, I had my course workbook, right? So PT workbook. And I'll never forget that one of the head bakers at the time said to me, "What's that?" I said, "It's a PT, personal training. I'm studying to be a personal trainer." And he said to me, "You'll never make a career out of that." He said, "Nobody's going to pay money for somebody to train them." Now, this was nearly 20 years ago, right? And he said to me, "What you need to do is you need to get a nice, secure job." He said, "I'll get you a job in the bakery with me. And in time, you can be a head baker, nice and secure, job for the rest of your life." And I thought to myself at the time, that certainly wouldn't light a fire in me. It certainly wasn't something I was passionate about. While I was studying personal training, it didn't really feel like work because I was so engulfed in the content. And not only that, I wasn't long after my leaving cert. I didn't remember anything in terms of leaving cert content. I couldn't forget the stuff I was learning in terms of PT. So the passion was there for me. But luckily, I also, let's say, got on that wave at the right time. The fitness industry was taking off, upward trajectory. So I was able to build a business. There was a want in the market for it. And when I think about you, you've obviously had a career before you set up Prymal. You were an athletic therapist, but you also saw this industry emerging. You were very much, let's say, on the cusp of this when it was about to start. And I'm just curious, if you think back to that time when this industry was only emerging and you think about the rapid growth that it's experienced in less than a decade, take us back to that time for yourself in terms of what would have been a real pivot moment for you in your career.
I would like to tell you that this was a really intentional read of the market. And I was like, okay, there's a wave coming here. I'm going to get ahead of this wave. But what actually happened was I did train as an athletic therapist. I did very little work in that sphere. I was very lucky. A friend of mine was a doctor and his dad was a GP. And his dad offered me a room to see clients in, which is almost unheard of when you graduate because it's essentially sports-based physio. You kind of got to do your time and you work for somebody else and you eventually build up enough experience and a client base to get your own room. Whereas I just walked into a room essentially and he had a ready-made set of clients who needed treatment. And so I had access immediately to a working base of clients. So I worked for 12 years in that environment, but very quickly I transitioned away from what I trained in, which was physiotherapy, athletic therapy. And I became a support worker, I suppose, for the GP practice. And then I became entrenched in all of the different avenues that we decided to move that business in. So we got into functional medicine and things like that. So 12 years I spent working with people on lifestyle, communication, relationships, and supporting the medical practice. So I had a kind of an exposure to a lot of different areas that were outside my specific training. And they all attracted me more than what I'd been trained in. So I transitioned away from the physio. But there was a kind of a core tenet throughout that entire decade I worked there that was really clear to me that was the most effective tool that I had and that worked and had an impact on our clients, and that was communication. So I noticed that the clearer we were with how we communicated with people, the more people understood their own health or mindset, that the better their outcomes were. And this became really clear to me over time. But I still didn't have a really clear idea what I was going to do with this. But in late 2019, I had started to develop the itch to maybe explore this side of my work a little bit more, because I was working in a support role in the clinic, and I really enjoyed the work, really enjoyed what I was doing. But I was never going to be a doctor. I was never going to be that part of the service, and I didn't really have a desire to be. But I knew there was something else that I could potentially do. I got the itch to start something myself. It was a side project. No real clairvoyant view on, okay, well, this wave is coming. And at the same time, probably a year or two before that, I had really started to develop an interest in podcasts and long-form conversation. And a lot of the work we did with clients in the clinic, I had initially heard of through conversations with medical professionals on podcasts. And it really interested me that this was a new way that I could learn and contribute to the business that we were growing, bring new resources and information in, present them to the doctor who I worked with at the time, and then he'd build protocols around them. So we had a really, really nice growth phase there, where a lot of the information came from me hearing something on a podcast. So that was probably my pivotal moment. But I started this, I'm going to loosely call it a business at the time, this project at the time, Prymal. And I didn't necessarily have a very clear business plan, but I knew communication was something I was very strong in. I knew the impact that that particular skill had on people's health outcomes from my experience. And I had a personal interest in podcasts and a little bit of experience with media and cameras and things like that. So I decided just to combine those. Didn't know exactly what the outcome was going to be. And this business was born. And that was the start of 2020. Just perfect timing. COVID, first lockdown hit in March 2020. So that was the kind of the origins of the business. But as we all know then, over the space of the next 2 or 3 years, content consumption went through the roof. People craved connection, long form communication. Podcasts really exploded during that time. And in the gaps between lockdowns, I started to notice I was getting huge interest in what I was doing, because at the time I was producing my own content, and because I was in the health space, I had a network of health professionals. I started to help some of those produce long form content to connect with their audiences while they couldn't physically connect. So they were doing it online. And then as the doors gradually opened again, I started to get a lot more inquiries from specifically business owners who wanted to build relationships and communities of people. So that's when I started to develop the business side of it. So it initiated as a project, a side project, and I transitioned away from working in the clinic then and went full-time into Prymal Productions. And that was 2020, and we're now 2025, late 2025. So 5 years now. And it's just evolved over time into something that's fundamentally based around communication, but has added lots of different layers to it now, as you know, because you're a client of the business. Yeah.
I am. And when I think about, let's say the benefit that I get from working with you, you mentioned the word communication, and when I hear communication, I always think of the George Bernard Shaw quote, the biggest misconception with communication is the illusion that it's actually taken place. What you've helped me with specifically is, let's say, the what, the why, the how, and the where when it comes to communication. So who is my audience? How am I going to connect with that audience? Where are they? Where can I reach them? And what is the best way to reach them? Is it short form videos? Is it long form podcasts? Is it educational videos? Is it courses, etc.? Obviously, you wrap all of that in one, let's say, bow for your clients. But every client that you work with, you also have a great understanding of how they differ, how their audiences differ, and what the overall goals are.
100%. When I think about the challenges in communication, and sometimes that term is intermittently used with, or interchangeably used with marketing. If you're in a business context, communication is marketing, how you communicate to your potential client or audience. I have over time seen 2 clear challenges that people or businesses or brands come up against. One is a lack of clarity themselves around what it is they're trying to say. What is the message? Who are they trying to communicate to? It's a real lack of clarity. And I know that because that's what I struggled with at the start as well. I fell into this business, as I explained. And so I didn't have a really clear direction or business plan, and didn't understand who I was talking to, who was I actually helping here. But I had an idea and a concept. And I have found, not just in the last 5 years, but in the 15 years I've been working with people, that's really common, especially at the founder level, where you have people who are passionate about something, like myself and yourself. You came from a PT background. I came from a medical background, athletic therapy background, but we've built businesses that we no longer really, that still forms the kind of core of what we do. We want to help people, but the businesses have developed into something else. So I find that with startups, founders, entrepreneurs, people who start a project themselves, especially if it's slightly outside the norm. So if you open a hardware store, it's kind of clear I'm opening a hardware store, I'm solving a certain problem. But if you're doing something that's a little bit different, I now put myself and yourself in those categories. These businesses we run have evolved as a result of the modern landscape. They didn't exist maybe 20 years ago in their current guise.
Yeah.
So we kind of have to figure out, what is it I'm trying to do? What am I enthusiastic about? What is the problem I'm solving? And who is this person I'm solving it for? So in my experience, that's problem one that a lot of people encounter when it comes to content, social media, marketing, communication. They don't know really, or they're not extremely clear on what it is they're saying or who they're speaking to, but they have a good idea and they're trying to figure that out.
Can I just before you go problem two, if that's okay?
Yeah.
I completely agree. And I'd love just to follow up and ask you, you said like hardware store, very clear what they do. But would you also say that for even conventional stores like that, you see them start to now branch out, build, and really focus on how can we separate ourselves from the other hardware stores? And then that's where maybe somebody like yourself can come in and really help with that process. So I completely agree. Like people like me and you, passionate about what we do, not always able to translate that passion for people to understand. But even in industries where, okay, yeah, I know what a hardware store does, but actually what's going to get me to go to Dan's hardware store and not Mark's hardware store?
You're a professional, Mark. You're a professional podcaster. That's actually problem two. Problem two I see is either, we'll call it big business, we'll call it well-established businesses or well-established industries. So it could be a small hardware store, but that's a big industry. Or it could be a really big company. In those cases, the challenge seems to be, I know what my service is, I know who needs the service, but I'm not exactly sure how to connect those dots because either I can't differentiate from all of the other hardware stores, or I don't know exactly how this new person, this new generation of people need to be communicated to or with to understand that I can help them with their problem. So they have a lot of clarity around what they do and usually around who they're trying to communicate or connect with, but are not exactly sure about the mechanics or the tools that they need to use. And I think a part of that challenge today is the modern landscape of consumption and content and how people find their information and why they make decisions around who they're going to engage with and what service they want to engage with. So that is actually problem two. So very nice segue there.
It's really interesting, the whole landscape, because it's evolved so fast. You know, if we went back 3-4 years, you know, there was no TikTok videos, there was no, but now what we see is all of these businesses well, not all of the businesses, you know, the businesses who are very much keeping up with what their consumers want to see, they're leveraging these networks. So as you said, they're not just doing part one and part two, but they're putting a lot of time and emphasis into part three. And I think what's interesting about that is like ultimately trying to meet your customers where they are, right? In a sense, it often looks like it's, you know, very casual, informal. You know, I'm thinking just as I was coming in here today, this morning I had a little scroll and there was, I think it was Windsor Motors, and they had all of their staff doing funny videos on TikTok. You know, again, very creative. It's stuck in my mind. I'm just curious as to, you know, when you look at the landscape and how fast it's evolved, are big businesses and small businesses, are they leveraging that third element of meeting their customers where they are, that short form content, etc.? Because I like how you've described, generally a lot of them can understand, let's say, part one and part two, but it's that third aspect that they find quite challenging maybe.
I'm going to answer this with two hats. The first hat is the reason I started this business. The reason it's called Prymal Production. I have a passion for helping people, connecting people, and communication. I really enjoy it when I was in the medical industry, and even when I worked as an AT. That's what really filled my cup back up, is seeing people feel empowered and take control of their own, and in my case, with health. That really, really fulfilled me. So the reason I run this business is to try and help number one, connect people together. That's why I love the podcast. That's why I have a physical space. People come together. I'm not a big fan of the online Zoom podcasts and things like that, specifically because I love to connect people, to bring people together. I think it's really important. And I think now more than ever, it's something that people really miss and crave just in the modern landscape. So that's why I do it. So with that hat on, I think small business, and I don't exactly know what the defining line is, but the founder entrepreneur type that I really enjoy working with are people like us who have a real mission, have a real passion. They see that they could help somebody. Usually, or in a lot of cases, they're people who've had an issue themselves or a problem themselves in the past that they've figured out how to solve, and they want to help other people solve that problem. And for those people, I think understanding how to use the tools to just connect the dots is really powerful, and it's very empowering, and it's a win-win situation. I can connect with the people that I want to speak to, because as you said earlier on, just because we start a business doesn't necessarily mean we understand the mechanics of how a business works and how to get it out there. We could be very good at what we do, but not very good necessarily at connecting that with the people who need it. So I have a real passion for that, and I think, in that scenario, I think there is a misunderstanding of what these tools are. We get consumed by, I have to have an Instagram profile because everybody has you have to do it now. That's what I hear the most common. I run a business, I have to have a social media presence. And I'm like, there is an element of truth in that, but maybe not for the reason that you think. You don't just have to be online.
Yeah.
It's just a tool for connecting and meeting people where they are. And the vast majority of people consume short form content. So it's an effective tool for communicating with those people. But if you don't understand how the tool works and how the people consume information, you're just going to feed the machine. You're just going to create content for this platform for the sake of creating it, and then become frustrated when it doesn't actually connect with the people. So that's answer one. I think that's a challenge that I love helping people solve. And it's just a reframing. Why are we using these platforms? Who are the people? Like, is it Mark who scrolls on his phone on TikTok when he's waiting to come in for a podcast? Okay, we need to be somewhere in his world and speak the language he can understand and resonate within 15 seconds with Mark. So can we do that with this tool? Brilliant. Or it could be LinkedIn, or it could be YouTube, or it could be a podcast, or it could be a newsletter, or it could be an in-person event. So that challenge is very real, and it's different for everybody. And it's not just have a social media presence. The other side, with the bigger business, it's a marketing exercise then. I'm not a marketing guy, but all of this stuff is inextricably linked with marketing. I'm content, strategy, and production. And I love that. I love the strategy, I love the production, and I love the problem I just described there, helping people connect with an audience. It is marketing. I'm not squirmy about that, but when you get into the marketing world, then you're talking about leverage and leveraging people's attention and sales. And again, there's nothing negative about any of these things, but I think, did we use this line in my podcast? With great responsibility, great power comes great responsibility. These are very powerful tools, and there's a lot of resources go in to understand how attention works. And this is an economy of attention, and that can be used to provide people with products and services that will improve their life. Amazing. I think that's fantastic. But what the challenge I see in big business is scale. You're talking to so many people. It's almost impossible to craft a narrative that connects on a deep emotional level with one person. So what I see is a lot of big business tend to focus on broad sweeps. So what is a common problem experienced by this demographic? And sometimes that can come across as salesy and not reading the room. And that might be a problem some businesses encounter, where they're just, for example, the motor company doing TikTok videos because they know TikTok videos go viral online. Does it connect the person with their product? Or does it give them some sort of emotional relationship with their product? Or is it attention hacking? So that's the question I always ask. And there's no, again, this is not a commentary on anything being negative, but I think it's an important question for big business to understand. Are we looking for massive attention, or are we trying to develop community here?
Brilliant. Because if I think about the experience I described, I remembered the video. So they got my attention. But is there any emotional connection to me wanting to go to that specific place to look at a car? No. So the story, let's say, behind the TikTok video wasn't very clear. They grabbed my attention, but I'll probably forget about it come this afternoon because there's no emotional connection. They haven't really impacted me at a deeper level. And when I'm speaking with leaders in the work that I do, I often try to bring in two, let's say, theoretical frameworks for them to remember. And one is around this idea of, it's called, comes from a German psychologist called Hermann Ebbinghaus. It's this idea of So the second one is filter, broadband filter, we're going to talk about in a second. The first one, forgetting curve, right? So it's this idea that ultimately, if we consume lots of information, there's a very good chance that we lose all of that information relatively quickly, okay? Unless it impacts us at a deeper level, unless we have some form of emotional connection towards that content that we've received. Like going back to my PT story, I remembered a lot of that information because I was very interested in it. It was very relevant specifically for me. When we think about whether it's from a marketing perspective or when it's trying to distill messages throughout our organization, we are giving lots of information, not really understanding that most of that information is going to be forgotten unless we make it meaningful to the people who are going to hear it. So should the, let's say, focus go on crafting the actual words in the message, or should the focus go on, actually, we're not answering the right question. The question should be, how can we make what we're going to say meaningful to these people? Because the second element I bring in for managers and leaders is this idea of the broadband filter, which is, again, they use the cocktail party effect. How can we be in a room with 50 other people, but if I'm chatting with Dan, I can consume what Dan is saying to me. I can hold my attention on Dan. But also, if there's a conversation happening across the room and I hear a word that's relevant for me, that's going to grab my attention. It's going to take my attention off Dan and onto that. And that's, ultimately that's how our brains work. They work in story. They like to filter out information. They don't like information overload. But I find we don't spend enough time in all these avenues, let's say, and I'm asking you this because it's what you do day in, day out, in terms of making those messages meaningful for the audience.
Yeah. I think there's, again, two elements to this. One is to round off your previous question about the bigger businesses. If the strategy is just to hack attention, I don't think it's as effective as it could be. However, as part of a bigger picture strategy, that's the first step nowadays. Because I think if you do have a meaningful message and want to connect emotionally, it's extremely difficult in the modern world to do that in 15 seconds. So building your traditional marketing funnel is based off these principles as well. That principle hasn't changed. We meet people where we are, top of funnel. That just happens to be short form content nowadays. So the TikTok video. But what's to say that on your drive home, there's a radio ad that's 35 seconds long for Windsor Motors. And that has a little bit of a deeper connection. You're more likely to listen now because they're front of mind for you, because you've seen their TikTok videos. Yeah. So not most, but a lot of businesses will have a very effective strategy using that funnel effect. But as a consumer, this is what I've noticed. If I get to the end of that funnel and feel like I've been misdirected at any point, that you didn't actually have my best interest at heart, even though you used the emotional connection and you got the attention at the start and you brought me deeper and I listened to the radio ad, now I've read the brochure and now I'm at the showroom. If I get the impression that, this car isn't for me at all and I've been misdirected, that's a negative outcome then, not because I won't buy the car, but I'm less likely to recommend and refer. So I think my approach to all of this is, and I tend not to work with a huge amount of large businesses because I said my passion is with the smaller stuff. Yeah. But on that question, all of the strategies and techniques are very effective, but they're kind of, for me, meaningless if the end result isn't a delivery on what you've promised with this big, beautiful journey you've crafted. And that's where I see, with the advent of modern tools, people and companies and businesses can get a bit distracted with gathering all of this attention at all costs. And because now we're in a room with not just 50 other people, with 5 million other people online, now it's who can shout the loudest. And it just tends to become a battle around shouting loudest. And we just forget a little bit about the next phases of the journey and how important they are to Mark, because we do want to actually add value to Mark's life at the end of the day. And whatever people's opinions on big business are, most businesses are there to solve a problem. So if they can solve that problem, and if they can bring people on that journey emotionally, as you say, and if they can hold attention, all of those elements, I think, are huge elements of business. And anybody who has any challenges, they tend to be weighing too much on one. Either they're so much solution focused, they don't know how to protect the message. They're so much attention focused that they forget they're actually solving a problem at the end of it here. So it's just a battle for numbers and for listens. or they haven't got an effective journey planned out that can help bring Mark along. They don't understand that he will consume short form for 2 or 3 months before he ever picks up a leaflet or listens to a radio ad, or he needs multiple exposures. And then when he moves to the next phase of that funnel, now he needs something different. It's not just more short form content that Mark needs. So they're all the challenges I see. I've actually forgotten your last question there, but I hope that answers it.
It does. And it's interesting because that filter theory from Donald Broadbent actually talks about 2 stages. The first stage is you've got to do something that will grab attention and then you make it meaningful.
Yes.
So if you make it meaningful without grabbing the attention, you're not going to get the audience. Yeah. And again, I reference this when I'm helping people with presentation skills. You start a presentation, generally how most of them start is, hi, my name is Mark and today I'm going to talk to you about this. You've already lost the audience. They're already starting to maybe look at their phones, check their emails. So what are you doing in that first 10 seconds to grab their attention? And once you have that attention, how do you make it meaningful? So combining both of them in that scenario is maybe, delivering a stat or a fact, which is going to get them engaged and then maybe ask them a question. All of a sudden, you've done both elements. You've grabbed the attention, you've made it meaningful. Now you've got the attention of the audience. And I'd love to, again, come to you in regard to your concept of how you do this with clients. And I've experienced this. I think we really take attention for granted, whether it's standing up delivering a presentation, whether it's coming up with this incredible video that we want to put out and we think it's absolutely amazing, it's going to captivate our audience. We are overestimating the amount of attention that people are going to give to that content.
It is one of the earliest messages I deliver to my clients. And I find it, just to preface this, I find it so interesting that I learned a lot of these lessons somewhat organically through my experience with medicine and seeing people in a vulnerable position and how they needed to be communicated to and dealt with and brought on a journey, and how they needed a space created for them where they could consume the information. If you imagine you're not well and you're in a doctor's office and the doctor's trying to deliver a message about your care or your medication or your lifestyle, you're in a state where you're not ready to absorb that information. So oftentimes it doesn't land and you don't know what to do and you feel overwhelmed. It's similar with anything that we do. We have to acknowledge that people may not be in the state to accept that information or consume that information. When I'm speaking to people who come in initially and they're interested in starting some sort of content strategy or a podcast, I do highlight this as a challenge for everybody. Understanding where people are, what their mindset is, how they need to consume information, and the attention piece. Because we, from the outside, only see the people who've broken through the noise. That's what we see because they've broken through the noise. And when we put all of this time and attention into creating something, almost in every case that I've worked with, there's value there. There is real value there, but that's not the point. The point is the value something that is resonating with the ideal person or client? Is it something that you've communicated in a staged way? Have you gathered their attention first, or have you just jumped out at them on the street and started telling them this beautiful story about how you could help them? Because people they're not going to consume information that way. Also, an acknowledgement that these tools are not neutral landscapes where you put content on and the people who are supposed to find it come and find it. I always use the phrase build it and they will not come. It's not like that. People don't just find your information. You have to have a strategy for presenting it to them. And sometimes that strategy needs to be very proactive. Understanding the tools, understanding where your specific clients or community members are and how to access them, how they consume information, then understanding the platforms. And to give an example, let's use Instagram as an example. And when you post content on Instagram, within the last kind of 12 to 14 months, the algorithms on these platforms are constantly shifting. This famous algorithm. And all the algorithm is it's these companies, their currency is attention. So all they're doing is figuring out ways to maintain more attention. If we understand that, we can use the tools more effectively. If we don't understand that, it becomes very frustrating. So on average, about 5 to 10% of your existing audience on most of these platforms will see your content. Instagram specifically we'll focus on now because this is one a lot of people use for business.
Only 5 to 10%?
5 to 10%, unless you have a really specifically curated audience or your audience has grown in a certain way. Most people, and this is because of this shift in the algorithm to what's called a For You algorithm. So the platform is now serving content, not necessarily to people who follow you, but to people that they think are going to engage more with the content, who might not necessarily be your follower group, because your followers could be friends and family initially, and then it could be a lot of people have platforms that they've built over time. And when they started the platform, the focus was one thing. And now maybe their business has evolved or grown or shifted, and the demographic shifts, or their demographic ages out and it's a new demographic. But the platform and everything around that platform or their profile is still targeted towards the original demographic. So there's no engagement metrics. So Instagram just goes, okay, well, the content isn't engaging. We'll show it to other groups of people that we know have this type of an interest, and we'll gauge if it interests these other people. And if it does, we'll increase those engagement metrics. But it's not necessarily in their interest to keep showing your existing followers content, because they want to engage more people on the platform. When we understand that, we can become less frustrated when we post content and it doesn't achieve the numbers that we want to achieve. And again, another piece of conversation I think is very important here is these are arbitrary numbers. They don't necessarily mean anything. A follower on a platform does not equal a customer because they haven't been on the journey yet. They are top of the funnel. And you always share this lovely story with me about presenting. If we can acknowledge when we put something in front of these people, a huge amount of these people are just not going to be interested. And that's okay. But if we can understand how to capture some general attention and then identify the people who do actually resonate, if we have a pathway for that, and a pathway could be a funnel, it could be different platforms, it could be short form to medium form to long form, it could be a newsletter, it could be a specific way you communicate, it could be a type of content. There's loads of ways of doing this. But if we don't understand that it's not just about having a number on a platform, it's about who these people are and how many of those people we can actually bring deeper into our community, that's where the problem exists that you highlighted there, that it's we don't get the attention that we want. I'm posting every day on Instagram and nobody's seeing the content. That's not this idea of the shadow ban that everybody thinks there is. That happens in a very small minority cases. These are private companies. There are political and cultural biases there, but it's not the vast majority of business owners who are trying to communicate with audiences. Nobody is shadow banned there. It's just a poor understanding of how these platforms work and a lack of reflection process. If you've posted content on any platform for a certain amount of time that's underperformed, if you did that in your business wouldn't survive. If you did the same thing over and over again for customers, but we tend to do that with Instagram because we're not particularly well, or any of these platforms, because we're not educated on, if this doesn't work, what else do I do? Because I was told to just keep posting content. That doesn't work anymore. And that doesn't go for short form alone. It goes for everything. We do it with podcasting. We're constantly reviewing the entire process. From when people come in and sit in the chair, how do you think they feel, Mark? And how do you feel you performed on that podcast? And did you get the responses you thought you would get from this person? When they said that thing you didn't expect, how did you respond? And that's brilliant. Okay, now the podcast is out there. What's the feedback you're getting? Is anybody listening? Have we noticed trends over time? Are people enjoying a certain type of content but not the other? And all of these are just data points. But if we don't have a process for understanding that over time, it's inevitable we're just going to keep doing the same thing and then becoming frustrated because we're not getting that attention. So it's none of these areas are particularly complex, but there's a lot of moving parts, and how you would design a strategy depends on what Mark's outcome is.
I like how you've described as well that they're not very complex. It sounds, not to you maybe, but for me trying to understand that.
The ecosystem is complex.
Well, that's where your expertise becomes extremely helpful for people like me.
Yeah. How they interact with each other is complex. The tool is very straightforward. And in most cases, most people know how to post on Instagram, but don't understand how that fits in with their mission and their bigger picture. So that's what I mean by the complexity. Anybody can do the things, but understanding how to do them effectively and reflecting and being able to improve them, that's where the complexity comes in.
And how much would you say, if we think about in today's society, if I think about, let's say, a leadership program, right? I deliver that program. Then I generally, as I'm going through the modules, I'll reflect. I'll do a lot of self-reflection, reflect on the content, try to get feedback, make sure that it's landing, etc. And then when I complete a program, I'll generally look back on that whole program, iterate that program for the next time I maybe deliver it. It sounds like in the world that you're living in, what we've been describing, that iteration process has to be done so frequently to keep your content relevant, your audience can actually get to it, as you said, build it and they won't come. So you've got to be constantly iterating that process. It sounds like that's changing constantly. How do you, I suppose, is that correct? And then how do you inform the people you work with to stay ahead of that?
It's absolutely correct. I think it's why businesses like mine have evolved in response to the modern landscape. Because traditionally, if something didn't work, it was a small part of a pipeline that you could tweak. But now you're not just dealing with a shifting audience or a shifting problem within your audience or your community that you're kind of, okay, well, they don't like this flavor anymore. Let's transition to this flavor. Now you're dealing with the actual tools that we use are mercurial, like they're just constantly shifting and moving because they're all private companies. I think it's really interesting landscape that we rely on these tools who are in themselves businesses to communicate our message. Yeah. And they're very powerful tools and they're incredible tools as well. My business wouldn't exist without them. I think they're fantastic. They connect people, they can communicate on them. But they're also controlled by a third party. And that third party makes decisions regularly that have nothing to do with us. And we have to adapt our strategies based on that. And also, because these companies, these social media companies are so powerful, they actually are changing consumer habits as well. So attention span has decreased. So that's a challenge that we've had to overcome as business owners. You highlighted it earlier on. Now we have to get our message. We have to capture that attention first. And that attention is 2 or 3 seconds now. It's 1 or 2 seconds realistically. People talk about the 5 to 10 seconds. That's gone now. It's 1 or 2 seconds. And we do this sometimes when we're creating content. I don't particularly like that we have to do this, but we need to capture attention if you have any intention of helping this person. We're doing a disservice to our clients if we can't engage with them where they now are, which is a really diminished attention span. So all of these things shift constantly. So I approach it from two directions. One, I absolutely try and keep my finger on not trends, but the landscape. What's shifting? What are the big shifts? So what is moving? What are the big players doing? Where are things trending to? And there was an inkling of this in me with the podcast stuff at the start. So it wasn't completely blind. I went into podcasting. It was a massive passion, but I was aware that a lot more people were consuming the content as well. So that's following a bit of a shift in consumption. So that's number one. I do try and keep, and I encourage all my clients as well to feed back to me. Because if I have multiple people experiencing something, I'll very quickly have a red flag raised. If everybody is saying to me something is happening on this platform or this particular piece of content is not doing well anymore, I'll get that from multiple sources. So immediately I'm like, okay, there's a flag here. Let's have a little look at this. For example, recently on one of the streaming platforms, they changed their copyright rules. Everybody was getting flagged for copyright incorrectly. But that's a big problem when people are producing content for their businesses. So that's something immediately that I had to get to the bottom of. And it turned out they changed their algorithm. It was really ineffective, but we had to adapt around it. So that's an example of route one. But what I'd like to do is maintain a set of principles that never change. We're still trying to be authentic and genuine. We're still trying to understand exactly who the person is we're speaking to. And all we're really adapting to is we're not adapting our message. We're just adapting how it's communicated and the tools that we're using. So we're not, to give you a really clear-cut example of what I mean, I work with a lot of people in the fitness industry because of my my previous work and the health industry. There's a huge trend in the fitness industry with online coaching of creating funny videos, humorous videos for TikTok and Instagram. A massive amount of online coaches become consumed by creating this identity of a funny online coach to get lots and lots of views. And they followed that trend. And very quickly, their businesses started to struggle because the people who were consuming that content were people who were interested in comedy, not necessarily fitness and health. So they followed a trend and immediately became trapped. So my conversation with those people is, we don't compromise what it is you're trying to do here. You're trying to help people to change their lives and improve their health. We can use the tools and we can use comedy, but as soon as we cross the line where that undermines your values and who you are and what you do, that's a problem for me and it's going to be a problem for you because I've seen it over and over again. So that's an example of a shift that people can become consumed by and why I like to take a principles-based approach always. Yes, we look at the tools and how they're changing and we do it. We've done this as well. We've created short-form content, which doesn't suit your industry because it requires a lot of detailed information and you're dealing with people who you know have complex problems at a systemic level or a managerial level or leadership level. Hard to do that in 15 seconds on TikTok.
You've pushed me to try and do it though.
But we've done it. But we've done it to a line where we know you're not creating a caricature of yourself.
Yes.
Or following a trend.
Yeah.
So they're the two ways I would approach that.
And that's brilliant, Dan. And I've kind of one follow-up thing just to say is what you said around attention spans. I think leaders, managers listen up to that, because I think we're approaching team members at the moment, not taking into consideration where a lot of our team members are spending their time. They're consuming those 15-second, 5-second, short form clips. But yet when we stand up to deliver messages to them, we're not taking that into consideration. We have to take that into consideration. And the second point that you mentioned there, what springs to mind for me is this idea, and I hear this word, by the way, all of the time in the work that I do with people who work within companies, right? We talk about this idea of personal brand and how do I build a personal brand? What you've described there really interestingly is there's like a scale, right? You've got your principle, and your principles are in the middle here, right? And then you've got, how would I grab attention? And then you've got, I'm doing absolutely nothing, right? We don't want to be down this end where we're not staying true to our principles and our values. And you have absolutely helped guide and direct me in that regard, because I was probably the other end of the scale. I wasn't doing enough in terms of to get those principles across, to build that personal brand. Mm. I'm just curious, when you think of that word personal brand, how has it evolved over the last number of years? Because as I said, I am hearing it time and time again within organizations, within programs that I work with people I'm coaching. I need to build my presence. I need to build my personal brand.
I think what's interesting to me is, like you, everybody knows this word now, and it means different things to different people depending on the context. My understanding of personal brand is, we've all heard the phrase people buy from people. So there has specifically, I think, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, as a result of pandemic and all this, there's been a rocking or a fracturing of trust in big business and big organizations and big corporations. Rightly or wrongly, there's a fracturing of trust there. And I think a response to that has been people becoming a little bit more critical, or evaluating a little bit more their decisions as to where they put their trust, their money, where they buy. And this idea of personal brand has evolved really fast from this, because a lot of big companies have huge teams dedicated to understanding buyer trends and psychology, and it's fascinating stuff. And understanding that a level of trust needs to be developed before somebody makes a decision to part with their money is correct. And I think that's why a lot of people are interested in this term now. And the other reason is with the growth of social media and influencers. And I think the word personal brand and influencing is conflated sometimes. Yeah. So in anybody who creates content online that encourages somebody to make a decision or anything like that is you're influencing people, and that can be used positively. But the term is now negatively associated, because it's associated with people who are just selling you stuff.
And I hear that, by the way, when a managers, they'll nearly eye roll and they'll say, I've been told I need to work on my personal brand. Exactly. As if, but I don't want to be an influencer.
I don't want to take pictures of my breakfast and my dog and then sell teeth whitening strips. Yeah, exactly.
But if I go on your LinkedIn profile and you have your role that you were in 15 years ago, you're not managing your personal brand. And I think that's where they find, let's say the disconnect is
100%.
It's not, as you say, taking pictures of your breakfast, but it's making sure that if I go to view Dan on LinkedIn, that I'm able to get a really good picture of who Dan is. And if there's some videos and some podcasts there, and I can look at some of them,
it's trust,
confidence, and trust. Yeah,
it's completely trust. So where I approach personal brand is trust. It's just another way of saying we need to generate a level of trust with the people who are potentially going to engage with your product or service. And that could be the staff that work with you, or your team. It's the same thing. Your personal brand, the brand of you, all these different ways of highlighting this is just another way in the modern landscape of content and technology and everything. Because so many people do have elements of their personality visible. If you don't, people start to just ask questions. Why can't I find out more about? Like, if you hear somebody's name now, people automatically Google them. If we've been doing that for years. What can I find out about this person? Because we want to feel that our investment of time or money or energy is a good one, and that we're safe, and that we're not going to have the wool pulled over our eyes. And as I said, why I think that's accelerated now is because of things like COVID and all these cultural and social issues that we have now. There is a lack of trust. So people are craving more. That's also why podcasting grew. If people can listen to you, if they listen to us now 30, 40 minutes in, whatever we are, they're starting to develop a better idea of who we are. Before this, I was just a face and a logo. And now people have heard me speak, and they have a bit of an understanding of what motivates me and what drives me. And that will resonate with some people, and it won't with others. So this is me developing my personal brand. It's also you developing your personal brand, because you're sitting here and you're hosting this, and you bringing me on develops your personal brand because I'm associated with you now. So all of these different things are other ways of saying we're giving people a deeper insight into who we are, what we do, and why we do it. That is essentially what personal brand is. You can build that out into a personal brand where you have the brand of Mark, and a lot of people, it's a similar challenge to the fitness business as I mentioned before. You can create a character. You create a personality that lives online that doesn't necessarily reflect who you are. Yeah. And there's no issue with that. We do a lot. We build businesses and we create these complete identities. However, that can be challenging for the individual. And if you work directly with people and your personal brand is A, and when the person meets you, it's B, that's another challenge you have to consider as well. So, personal brand is definitely something a lot of people think about, but depending on the room you're in, it means different things to different people. And most people have the reaction you mentioned about the leaders. I don't want to be an influencer. I don't want to use Instagram and TikTok. I'll just say right now, you don't have to use Instagram and TikTok, but considering how people interface with you in a digital space is probably a good thing to do. Just being able to consider that.
I often think as well, considering the question, how do you think people view you? I often ask managers and leaders, how do you think you're viewed? Oh, and a lot of the time, they're like, oh, I actually don't really give that a lot of thought, because you said there about as well, which I thought was very interesting, this idea of personal brand being this, and then the reality is that you're this type of person. And then if we translate that towards the business world, right, more and more research shows us that people buy into authentic leaders who can be managers, who can be vulnerable, who can show up and not be afraid to kind of give a little bit of what's under the hood. Also knowing, what the level or the depth is that I want to go to. So that word being authentic now is, it's everywhere when we think of organizational performance. I don't think many managers or leaders are giving it the time and attention that it really requires to do it right. Because we also know the individual who shows up and is not being authentic, right? They're over-egging the empathy side. You can tell that it's disingenuous. And I think that individual nearly makes us run as fast as the individual who maybe is autocratic.
Yeah. I think it's a cultural issue. I'm interested in your commentary on these spaces inside bigger companies and businesses. And the word culture there, it's a cliched word, I know, in those spaces. For me, we have a certain culture in here. It's the same in the public sphere. It's the same. And unfortunately or fortunately, these tools that we use now to market our businesses, they're public tools. It's the public town square, and there's cultural things there. It's a difficult space to be genuine and authentic or vulnerable, because you're going to get absolutely sure. There's going to be people who don't like that. Yeah. And that's a challenging thing. And it's a real not concern, but challenge I highlight at the start of any journey like this. We don't have to use any of these tools necessarily. Considering the idea of personal brand could be just how you show up in work. And this is a challenge we've had for a long time. Are you the same person in work that you would be on the street? No is the obvious answer, because there's a professional version of Dan. There's a version of Dan you'll get on the football pitch, which is a different guy. There's a version. But I would like to think that they're just slight adaptations to my environment as opposed to different personas.
Yeah.
And this persona piece is difficult. In business, it's the same thing. A lot of my friends work in big business or tech jobs or corporate jobs, and I can see them having to completely change their persona in these environments, because it's not necessarily in the culture to be a bit more authentic or genuine or vulnerable. So there's a bigger conversation there around is it okay in these spaces to be a little bit more vulnerable? And as you said, you can decide the level that you go to. It's not influencery, Instagram-y. it could just be a subtle shift in how you communicate with people and a subtle shift in how you present yourself and things like that. That's all personal brand. Same conversation when you're thinking about content and marketing. It doesn't have to be a complete lifting of the veil and here is me, warts and all, buy from me. Some people do that. But it is just an acknowledgement that you would like to see a little bit more about who I am and what I do and what motivates me. And this is what I'm happy to share. And this gives you some insight into who I am. And if I meet you in person, we work together, you'll also feel that off me. And if you happen to meet me in the street, you'll also see, it's just, okay, I like this person. I want to engage with them. If you're trying to grow a personal brand, I think that's how you can think about it, rather than I need to do this, or I need to have a video on Instagram every day, or I need to go into work and cry so the guys see that I'm a certain type of. That's not what I'm talking about here, but I can see why it's a challenging conversation for people, and that's why when we meet first and people talk about developing the personal brand, I want to understand what you're trying to achieve here, and then we can decide what pathway fits, because there is no one size fits all.
Your diagnostic, I have to say, that diagnostic process,
Okay,
I think is fantastic. You know, before we do anything, I remember my experience, there's a lot of pre-work together to make sure we're very aligned on what the overall goal is, which is not dissimilar to how I approach what I do. So again, I really appreciated that. And interesting, the topic that we're discussing, because I think one thing that I'm seeing emerge, and it's probably piquing my interest for a potential thesis topic, is this idea of emotions and how emotions show up in business, right? And specifically, there's emerging research looking at emotions around aspects like decision making, you know, because it's not really something that we take into consideration. You know, emotions and making a decision are normally things we try to separate. We should make a rational decision, not an emotional decision. But actually, what role is emotions playing in that, in terms of that collective, in terms of the people making the decision? And I think to your point around this idea of building a personal brand, it's being mindful that we, at the end of the day, are human beings. We connect with one another based on emotions, and how are we filtering those in to the right level in order to make a connection? You've said the word connection over and over again, and I agree. How are we trying to connect with our audience, whether that's a podcast audience, whether it's a team in work? Am I proactively putting work into figuring out, how do I connect effectively with this group? Because until I can do that, they're not hearing what I'm saying.
100%. What I love about these conversations, and we've spoken about this several times before, there's nothing in what I do at a fundamental level that's different from what you do, or that's different from what somebody on a health journey does, or on a fitness journey does, the people who help with those journeys. It's understanding that at the core of all of this, we're human beings. And everything above that is just environmental or situational or strategic, but at the core, we are human beings, and most of us make decisions based on our emotions and how we feel. There's a friend of mine always says, emotion is energy in motion. It is a certain amount of energy in motion somewhere. Yeah. And that could be chaotic and it could drive you, or it could be harnessed and used functionally. But yeah, I think at the core of all of these, like most of the lessons, talking to you is really interesting to me, because you've brought a lot of academia and academic containers to a lot of things I would have learned organically working with people in the medical industry. And in the medical industry, you're working with pure emotion. People are scared, they're vulnerable, they're upset, they need to feel safe, they need to feel heard, and they need to feel like you have their best interest at heart. In my opinion, that is where people get the best medical outcomes. When they have that, when you can provide that for somebody, even if you don't have the latest technology or medication or strategy, if you can provide that for somebody, their outcomes are going to be much, much better, because they feel empowered and they feel safe and they make better decisions, and they're less controlled by the emotions. Emotions are completely normal, but they make less rash decisions based on emotions. In this world, it's the exact same thing. If we understand that, one, we are human and emotional, and two, the person we're trying to speak to is human and emotional, it actually helps sort out a lot of the strategic stuff, because we're no longer thinking top down from what platforms do I use and how often do I post and how many strategies do I need, what's my brand color, what's my logo. We're actually thinking, okay, I need to speak to Mark. What's he feeling and what am I feeling? Okay, now here's all the tools I could use. Right? He won't like that one. He's very overwhelmed, so we'll get rid of this one. Okay, now we have a clear set of tools. Let's bring those to the table. Okay, now how do I feel about using these tools? because I don't like Instagram and TikTok, but I love podcast and long form. Excellent. Let's get rid of Instagram and TikTok. Okay, now we have a long form piece of content that you can use to communicate effectively with Mark. And you can acknowledge that you're a little bit more emotionally safe here, and they engage in a much more calm and regulated way with that piece of content. There's your foundation. Off the back of the foundation, you can build out any other tools you feel might help on that journey. But that's the core. I am a human being with emotions, and so is Mark. And we need to be able to connect those somewhere. And I think the distracting part for most of us is I have to have 15 platforms with a huge team. And 100% you can scale to that, and they work really, really well in certain cases. But especially with the type of business owner and founder that I work with, and me personally, I think that's the cornerstone of a strategy, is understanding we are humans. And all of our conversations, you're able to provide so much context for me, and I've worked with you on a coaching basis as well, that really helps me get clear on something I've done quite organically. I'm like, oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense. I do that naturally, or I've learned that through my work in the medical world. But it actually is supported by a lot of academic research and psychology, which a lot of this ultimately boils down to human psychology, really. And marketing is essentially human psychology. Yeah. Content is human psychology. But yeah, it always, I think if you can't pair it back to that emotional piece and that human piece, there's work to do. There's definitely work to do.
Do you know what was interesting? I had an idea to ask you based on our conversation today. The last question I was going to ask you was, how has your experience, as you described it, in the medical world influenced what you do today?
Fundamentally.
And you've just answered that very, very, very well. Dan Campion, thank you very much for your time today. I have taken so much from that, and I know that our listeners will too.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining me on the Lead Well podcast. As always, if you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit that subscribe button.